Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Parsons from the University of Nebraska, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar titled Seasonality of the U.S. Lamb Industry. This webinar is brought to you by the Let's Grow Committee of the American Sheep Industry Association. We'd like to start by thanking them for their support of these webinars and to encourage you to visit their website and learn more about the American Sheep Industry Association. That URL for the ASI website is www.sheepusa.org. On there, you can also access all of the Let's program materials, and they have a lot of things on there, including recordings of all our past webinars. They're up under the programs on the main menu of the ASI website, or you can also access them directly using the URL growourflock.org. I'd like to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded, and all of you that registered for it will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a direct link to the webinar recording, as well as a link to the webinar slides. These will be posted on the ASI website and available for watching at a later time, so look for those when you get a chance. We are slated for about a 30 to 45-minute presentation. Reed and I were talking about that earlier. So we'll try to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, so we should have at least 20 to 30 minutes left for questions. I'll save all those questions. I'll keep track of them throughout the presentation, so feel free to type them into the question box on the lower right-hand side of your control panel, and then I'll feed those to Reed at the end of his presentation. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. A lot of you know Dr. Reed Redden. He comes to us from San Angelo, Texas, where he's a sheep and goat specialist and an associate professor of animal science with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Dr. Redden's pedigree includes a PhD in ruminant nutrition from Montana State University, a master's degree in reproductive physiology from New Mexico State University, and a bachelor's degree in animal science from Texas A&M. As many of you know, Dr. Redden has taken on a leadership role in a number of different projects for the American sheep industry over the years, including projects in Texas and North Dakota and Montana, places that he's worked and got his PhD. But also, you recall he was on with us a couple of years ago presenting a webinar on the series of 12 publications titled The Best Practices to Increase Your Lamb Crop. That was a major national effort, and we're happy to have him on here again on another major national effort, which is this white paper on the seasonality of the lamb industry. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to Reed for his presentation. Sorry. And we'll go ahead and let him present some of the information that's in that document, and I know you guys will find it really interesting. I know I did when I read through it. So Reed, the floor is yours, and I'll be back when you're done, and we'll handle some questions.
Very good. Thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Good. Well, it is my pleasure to be with you all this evening to give you an overview of the seasonality of the U.S. lamb industry. As Jay mentioned, this is a white paper that I and some others helped put together. And, to be honest, I learned a lot myself going through and putting this white paper together, and I thought I kind of knew some of the issues within the seasonality or the issues pertaining to seasonality. But as we went through all these different key points, I learned a lot, and hopefully this information can help the industry as we move forward and try to resolve some of the issues that we have with seasonality. There we go. All right, I'm just going to give you a brief outline of kind of what we're going to go over. First, I'm going to give a little bit of a background of how the white paper came to be and who all was involved in it. And then we'll go into the seasonality of supply. Throughout the white paper in this presentation, we're going to be discussing both the traditional side of the industry and the non-traditional side of the industry as it pertains to both supply and demand. As I mentioned before, we'll get into the demand for U.S. and import lamb throughout this presentation focusing on both traditional and non-traditional consumers, discuss a little bit about the market incentives that exist for sheep and goat or sheep farmers and ranchers, and how they can get a little bit more money for their animals depending on the time of the year that they produce them. Do a little bit about aseasonal breeding, but I'm not going to get into this in big detail. I believe Dr. Richard Earhart, who was an author of this publication, had done some aseasonal breeding webinars that Jay's hosted as well, so no need to be redundant there. And he's the expert at it anyways, so I'll leave him to that. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions, some summaries, and hopefully have some time for some questions. So just giving a bit of a background, the white paper was commissioned, if you will, by the U.S. Lamb Industry Roundtable. The roundtable consists of about a dozen, maybe slightly less, industry leaders that represent a number of different segments of the industry. And it's a committee that's continuing to use the roadmap that was developed a number of years ago as a guide for the industry moving forward, looking at some top-level industry issues, identifying a few of those, and then creating actionable items to try and create things that we can do to maybe resolve some of these issues. In this particular example, seasonality was highlighted by the roundtable, and it was proposed then from the roundtable to the American Lamb Board to write a white paper on it and educate the industry better about what the issues are and how we can address it. And that's as really came to fruition, and here is where we are today. This funding seeked authors. I was the lead author and lead organizer for the white paper. Dr. Richard Earhart was also tapped because of his knowledge with aseasonal lambing. And then we also reached out to the industry and got Cody Heinke from Nyman Ranch and Mapleton Mend, and then Erica Sanko from California Wool Growers. And we were just trying to get a small group that could get something done, but also represent different parts of the country and also different segments of the industry. And then within the white paper, we had some final publishing done by Demeter Communications, just really kind of made it easy to read and easy to follow as us authors put together the nuts and bolts of the white paper. So when we look at seasonality of the U.S. Lamb industry, it's based off of a seasonal lambing event. You know, often we don't even think about this. We just plan on lambing at a certain time of the year because that's the way it kind of had always been done. But why is it that way? Well, first and foremost, sheep are short day breeders, meaning that as the days are getting shorter, they become more fertile than the rest of the year. And that is set up so that more of the lambs are born in the spring. Typically in the spring, we have more feed resources that are available, and it gives a better chance of survival for the lambs because the ewes' nutritional requirements are going to increase probably twofold when she has a lamb, if not two lambs on her side. Another reason that farmers and ranchers are going to target lambing at certain times of the year is to avoid harsh weather conditions. Typically in the northern part of the U.S., we're avoiding cold winter weather, but even in the southern part of the U.S., we may be moving up lambing into the earlier in the year so that we're avoiding, you know, harsh, hot weather where lambs aren't growing. As such, there is a large segment of the lambs are born in the first 5 months. To be accurate, it's estimated that 85% of the lambs in the U.S. are born in the first 5 months of the year. We see this in the graph here with January on the x-axis and going across by month all the way to December. The red bars are the months that lambs are born. And you can see in January, 12% of the lamb crop is born in January, and then a jump to 18% in February, followed by March, April, and May. And so those months combining to 85% means that a large number of lambs are going to be sold as feeders, and then those feeders are all going to end up at the harvest level within the same time frame. As such, that supply will oversupply the infrastructure. Some people will normally say, well, why don't we just go ahead and harvest more of them and shut down for a few months? And that really doesn't work for the packing houses. They need to stay open. Their employees need jobs throughout the year, and they need to supply a consistent fresh lamb to the domestic consumer throughout the year. So the brown bars, as you'll see, is the percent of lamb crop harvested by month throughout the year. And you can see that it's fairly steady. There is a slight uptick in March and April, and then it kind of slides back down. But year on year, each month, there's a fairly consistent number of lambs harvested. So in essence, the industry has to figure out ways to spread out those lambs so that they hit the market throughout the year. But it kind of even gets more complicated from there, because we have two different supplies of lambs. We have a traditional supply of lambs, which are heavier lambs. Target weight would be 145 pounds. This will be live weight going to harvest. And most of those traditional lambs are going to take in the neighborhood of a year to reach market. Those lambs are going to be born. They're going to be weaned off their mother at 90 to 120 days of age. They're going to then go into a feeding facility for a number of months till they hit this final weight. Most range lambing or range ewes will take that year long to get there. However, our farm flock animals are growing at a much faster pace. They have a higher feed resource supply, so they're typically going to come to market a bit sooner. And then whenever we look at, there's also a light lamb or a non-traditional supply. So in Texas, we supply a lot of light slaughter lambs going into the non-traditional market. And the ideal lamb weight, live weight, is around 65, maybe 80 pounds. So because they're harvested at such a smaller size, they're also harvested at a much younger age. So the non-traditional supply, the majority of those lambs are making it to market in the summer months. So if we think about our traditional lamb consumer, what is the path to the plate, if you will? For our traditional lamb consumer, those lambs are going to come off the range, go to a lamb feeding facility, be at that feeding facility for a period of time, go to a processor. That processor is going to take those lambs, harvest them, break them into primals. Then they're going to go to wholesale, but the consumer is going to either get them at the retail or the restaurant level. So that's how I kind of define and how the traditional lamb consumer is defined in the white paper. Our non-traditional lamb consumers are very diverse, but they don't follow that same channel. For the most part, our non-traditional lamb consumers typically are recent immigrants into the U.S. from less developed countries. They're typically of Muslim faith, and typically sheep and goat meat are a common protein source in their diets. But there's going to be upticks around religious events. The two big ones are the Eid al-Fitr. I probably said that incorrectly, but that is a 2-day festival at the end of Ramadan. And then there's another festival, which I believe finished up today, the Eid al-Adha, which is the sacrifice feast, or the festival of sacrifice. So those two major events are whenever we see an increase in sheep sales going towards the ethnic consumer. These holidays are based on an Islamic calendar, which does not fit with the typical American calendar. And so these happen every year, but they move up 10 days to 2 weeks every year. So right now, this religious event fits quite nicely with a lot of the non-traditional lamb supply, because we supply a lot of the light lambs in the summer. If you roll the clock back half a dozen to a dozen years ago, whenever this market was in the fall and in the winter, where we have a short supply of light slaughter lambs, these religious holidays had a bigger impact on the industry itself. But as current, we have quite a good supply for them. But ethnic or non-traditional consumers aren't the only consumer in a non-traditional market. We also have the direct-to-consumer. These lambs don't go through the traditional chain. They're typically processed at a local processing plant, sold through farmers markets or local marketing. And so that's just kind of to define the two different lamb consumers as we move through this presentation. Okay, so moving back to the traditional industry, if we look at month by month the average dress weight for lambs, we'll see that in January, February, and March, the typical carcass weight is in the 71 to 73 pounds carcass size. All right, that's kind of the typical lambs throughout the year. But as we move through the spring months, more and more lambs are coming into the feedlot and remaining in the feedlot, and we can't keep up with harvest. So it tends to be where the carcass weights are going to go up. By May, June, typically we've run through most of the prior year's lamb crop, and carcass weight starts to slide down all the way through October, that October time frame, and then carcass weights start going up again. So if you look at the relative change, it's say just kind of an average in the winter and spring months, it's around 72 pounds. And then when you get to the bottom of it, it's about 67 pounds. So that relative swing isn't that big. Actually, whenever I walked through the data set, I thought, well, this wouldn't have that big of an impact. But normally averages tell you the truth, but that's not the case here. So what we did is we went through and sorted this by month by carcass weight categories. And so what you'll see here is each month there's a number of different bars of different colors, and that's the weight category of lamb carcasses that are going into the federally inspected chain. So in January, very few of those carcasses, let me see if I can get the mouse up here, very few of those carcasses are under 55. And even fewer of those, or just slightly more, I should say, are in that 55 to 65 pound range. Then the blue is 65 to 75. This lighter colored, kind of a tan color, is 75 to 85. The green is 85 to 95, and then yellow is 95 and up. And so as we move into the spring months, we move to a point to where we go from almost no 95 pound carcasses to May and June, where we have almost 25% of the carcasses are 95 pounds and up. And this creates a major challenge for our packers because they have to find a market for all of these large carcasses. And as they tell me, there is good markets for the whole range of carcasses from big to medium sized to small. But the problem comes whenever we have a lot of large carcasses for a few months, and then a few months later, all of those carcasses are gone. So they create a customer for this year, and then the carcasses are gone. And the same way for the small to medium-sized carcasses. They're running around 20 or 30%, but then when all the large carcasses are gone, lambs have to go through the plant, and then this 65 to 75 goes in May. There's only in the neighborhood of 20%. And then a few short months later in September, we're looking at close to 50% of the carcasses are in that category. So that category swing can have create some challenges for the industry. We also see that there is a pretty strong effect throughout the year on the price of traditional slaughter market lambs. So when we look at January and February, March, it's fairly steady market. But then when a lot of these large lambs get into the feedlot, the feedlots are full, there's lots of lambs to go to harvest at the same time, we have an oversupply and the market drops through May, June. Typically, those old crop lambs are worked through, and then the market picks up as we're having a harder time finding the new crop lambs. We have highs in the market in July, August, and September, and then that market comes back down in the fall. This year didn't follow this trend as well. I think a lot of extra lambs were held on to later and later in the year, didn't stay as current, so the market stayed a little bit depressed a little bit longer, but that's not in the white paper itself. This white paper was started in the fall, or in the summer and fall of 2017, and was concluded in the spring of 2018. That's why some of the dates in some of these graphs they're not old, but they're not ultra current as well. And so as I communicate this to different people within the industry, even within the San Angelo area, we have wool sheep producers that produce feeder lambs that go into the traditional market. And we have hair sheep producers that are producing lightweight slaughter lambs that are going into the non-traditional market. And they have almost polar opposite issues with when there's an oversupply. And this graph dictates that quite well. This is a graph that was put together by some colleagues of mine here at the San Angelo Research and Extension Center. Bill Thompson was probably the most influential in putting this together, and he keeps a lot of this data current on our website at sanangelo.tamu.edu. But what this shows is the volume of lambs that are sold at the livestock auction here in San Angelo and the price of those lambs throughout the year. So the volume is in the red line. So if you'll look over at January and February, on a month-to-month basis, it's less than 15,000 animals per month. And then in March, there's a rapid jump to 30,000. And it holds at that 30,000 level through June or July. So in Texas, a lot of lambs are born in the early winter, midwinter, and those lambs, and then throughout the spring, those lambs all start coming to the market in the spring and early summer. As such, it really depresses the market, and so some of our producers are seeing lambs being sold at or around $2 a pound in January and February, and then a few short months later in June and July, the market's dropped to less than $1.50 a pound. And so it really is a supply issue, and that supply trying to work through the infrastructure, getting that to the consumer. So domestic production of lambs isn't the only factor in here. We also have imported lamb that is marketed to the American consumer, and it has an impact on price throughout the year to some degree. This graph doesn't show month to month. This is throughout the year, and I thought it was important to have this in here just so that people see the relative change in domestic production versus imported supply of lambs. And so from 2010, 11, and 12, when the American dollar was fairly strong, there wasn't a lot of imports, or it was fairly weak in comparison to the Australian dollar. And then as the American dollar got strong, it becomes more favorable to import lamb, and imported lamb is at quite a large discount to domestically produced lamb. And you see that market share has been capitalized with imported lamb throughout. And so one of the common things that I hear is we need imported lamb to make up for the seasons whenever we don't produce lamb, because they're on the other side of the equator. So, we're lambing in the spring, they're lambing in the spring, but their spring is our fall. That at first glance makes a lot of sense. However, whenever you look at the monthly average amount of imported lamb that's brought into the United States, you do see a peak, and that peak is in March, and it slides all the way down, and the lowest is in September. Most of the imported lamb is competing typically with our traditional lamb industry. And if you'll recall a couple of slides ago, our weakest point in supply is July, August, and September, which coincides with the lowest volume of imported lamb. So imported lamb isn't really making up for the times that we don't produce it. It's actually fitting times where we have an increase in demand. And that's where we'll move into now. So the next few graphs that I'll show are fresh look data set that we received from the American Lamb Board. This is volume of retail sales. This is not demand, it's just volume of sales. And I'll just orient you to these slides. The yellow lines are 2013. The orange lines are 2015, the blue or 2014, the blue lines are 2015, the purple lines are 2016, and the green line is 2017. And you'll see on the x-axis left to right is January through December. So it's pretty easy to see a large spike in April. So if we move back one slide, I'm having a trouble with my cursor, so we may actually not go back one slide. But if you'll recall in the last slide, there was an increase in volume of imported lamb in March. And that increase in volume as March is leading right up to our increase in sales in April. Those April sales are mostly linked to Easter lamb. So Easter or lamb being consumed for Easter dinners. And then if you look at the far right side, you'll see another spike in lamb sales. And that is increase in lamb sales just prior to Christmas. And so it is common that some families are going to have a leg of lamb for Easter and a rack of lamb for Christmas. And that's kind of evident in this graph. But within each or within a lamb, they don't eat the whole lamb in these different chains. We have to look at cut by cut. So if we look at the leg sales throughout the year, it has a huge spike around Easter. So just kind of looking at the left side, which is pounds of lamb sold in the retail, you notice that in January, February, March, leg sales are around 1 million pounds. And then in April, it jumps up to somewhere between 3 and 4 million pounds. So threefold the leg sales in 1 month. And that rapidly falls back off, kind of holds steady throughout the summer and into the fall, and then right up until our Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays in November and December. There's an uptick again in lamb leg sales. Now, then if we look at the rib section, which is typically rack of lamb, maybe rib chops, but most of this is roast, we see a similar effect, but less pronounced. Typically, rib sales are in the 400,000 pound range for most of the months, but there's 100 to 200, 250,000 increase around Easter and a similar increase around Christmas. So we're seeing some definite seasonal impacts for leg and rib sections. Now, when we move into the loin, most of our loins are going into lamb chops. There's not quite as evident of a season or a month that's really changing in sales. What we see is each color line is going up, which is a good positive note that our lamb chop sales are going up year on year, but no season, which creates some challenges. So then if we look at a similar effect of ground lamb has increased quite a bit. You can see 2013, 14, 15, 16, and 17, each year is incrementally higher, which is a good thing. More people are eating ground lamb, but they don't have a seasonal effect. So it's not like we can produce lambs leading up to Christmas and Easter and sell the whole lamb at that season, because different segments of the lamb have different demand seasons. So you think, okay, if we've got different seasons, one of the easiest way would be frozen product. Let's freeze it, lock it in, then can thaw it out throughout the year to meet the consumer's demands. Would be an easy solution, except for the fact that the majority of food service and retail customers are averse to buying frozen lamb. And it makes sense. They get beef, pork, and poultry available fresh year-round, especially for the meat counters where most lamb sales occur. And even if I think of my own family, we're not going to go to the frozen food section to buy lamb. If you're going to buy a higher end product, you're typically, or a more expensive product, you're typically going to buy it fresh, or you're going to be looking for it fresh. You may take that, and my family does that a lot. We'll go buy some, say, ribeyes from the beef side. I normally don't buy a lot of lamb because I eat our own, but we'll buy a number or more steaks than we'll eat. We'll cook some of them and freeze some of them. And I think that's true of a lot of American consumers, is they just want that fresh. But that's not cut by cut specific, because some cuts our American consumer will take them a bit more, or take them frozen more often. We think of those primarily in shanks, shanks being a cold weather demand cut. We do a lot of Ossobuco shanks and those type of things in the winter, but don't sell a lot of those in the summer. And I think the consumer will take those frozen products, or at least the wholesalers that are distributing them will take those frozen more readily than our higher value cuts like the lamb chops or rack of lamb. Legs, it's kind of in the middle. As you can see back in those earlier graphs where we're selling 3 times the amount of leg in 1 month than we do each month on either side of it, there's just going to be a necessity to freeze or chill and hold those legs leading up to those holidays. How all that's done, the logistics of it, I'm not exactly sure. That's not in my forte, but it is done to some degree, especially leading up to the Easter holiday. Now, frozen product for direct marketers, really a non-issue. And I see this a lot. I do sell some lambs to friends and family. And most of that product, those lambs will go into a local butcher shop. They'll hang for a couple of days. They're processed. All of it's frozen, put in a box. They'll take it home and put it in their freezer. But since they had that direct communication with me, they know who produced it, when it was produced, they have more confidence in that product than if they were going to a meat counter at a grocery store. They're going to want that fresh. So we've covered a number of these topics. What kind of market incentives exist for people to produce a seasonal lamb? As we saw in some of those earlier graphs, there's an evident seasonal price that exists, and that's probably the biggest market incentive that's out there. If those seasonal prices were more consistent, I think we'd see more people going after them. But they do fluctuate a little bit season to season, week to week, and I think that creates some confusion and maybe doesn't allow some people to jump off the cliff and go down that road. Some packers have their own techniques to cover demand throughout these seasons. One of those by providing seasonal premiums on contracts. So the people that supply on lambs, they just put it in their contracts that if they can produce during these off seasons for that carcass range category that they're looking for, there may be some built-in premiums. There may be some other seasonal no less than price contracts, basically a floor price that gives some producers a break-even number that they'll go after. I'm not sure. It's kind of infringing on private business to know which packers use those techniques, but they do exist. Packers also will use inherent things like knowing that the ewe lambs are going to be earlier maturing, a little quicker growing to a final point before they start getting too fat. So if they buy a load of lambs, they'll sort the ewe lambs off, get them through the chain faster. Whereas the crossbred wethers, those are typically larger frame. They put condition on later in life so they can background them, hold them, stretch out that market and still have a fairly decent quality product at the end of the day. And the only issue with those two is those carcasses are going to have some variability. Those crossbred wethers may be the 95 plus pound carcasses that may not be overly fat, and those ewe lambs may be in that 65 to 75 or the 55 to 65 pound carcass range with a little bit more condition, even at those lighter weights. So we've talked about some of these techniques. If you're a producer and you're thinking, all right, I'm going to make some, I want to look at making some changes to when I produce lambs for these different seasons. What are the techniques that I would go about doing that? First and foremost, plain and nutrition is probably the most important thing. Especially if we're doing spring breeding for fall lambing, or summer breeding for that early winter lambing, we have to have our nutrition better on par than if we were breeding in the fall. So that's a management alteration, that those ewes need to be in better condition and on better feed than we would think when we traditionally bred them in the fall. If not, we may be dissatisfied with the number of animals that breed and we only get a 30 or a 40 or maybe only a 10% conception rate, whereas if we had our plain and nutrition better, it might bump that up. Ram effect and higher ram coverage is essential to get some out of season breeding. Often in the spring, And in the summer, ewes aren't going to be cycling depending on breed, and we're going to need a highly vigorous ram and a number of rams to create competition to stimulate the ewes to come into estrus, so that they'll breed and have those aseasonally produced lambs. Exogenous hormones are an option. Cedars are an option. Unfortunately, they tend to be expensive, and we don't always get the consistency that we're looking for. Light therapy, controlling the light in the winter and early spring to mimic shorter days, is another strategy to get both ewes and rams prepared for an out of season breeding. And so that's something to look at. And again, as I mentioned before, there's some webinars that have been covered and go into these technologies a lot more in detail. And I encourage you, if you've got questions about that, to go to those, go to that webinar and watch it. And last, but certainly not least, is genetics. Some breeds are better at it than others, and within any breed, some animals are more seasonal than others. And so it's important to understand that and use that to your advantage. So as we dig into what technologies are needed, if our industry is going to move towards more aseasonally produced lambs, what technologies would help us get there faster? One thing that is true is aseasonal breeding is consistently inconsistent. Within the white paper, we went through and covered some case studies of successful breeders that have moved to aseasonal lamb production. And in many of those cases, these farmers and ranchers report about their challenges with the inconsistency periods. That some years it's 90%, some years it's 40%, some years it's 10% breeding for those fall lambing periods. And so we do need technologies that'll help us with this. The one technology that's probably most needed is better genetic predictions for aseasonal lambing, both quantitative and molecular. Quantitative being an estimated breeding value. We don't have an estimated breeding value for aseasonal lamb production within NSIP currently, and it's something that we've looked into but have not been able to employ yet. And what could help us get there quicker is if we could identify molecular markers and do genomics, through genomics, being able to identify which animals have a less defined breeding period and allow us to produce those aseasonal lambs easier. Also, a better understanding of what strategic nutritional management is needed. Nutrition is typically our most costly inputs for production, so we don't want to overfeed, and sometimes when we overfeed, it can give us just as many problems as underfeeding. So better exogenous hormones, better light therapy protocols could be beneficial. Unfortunately, I don't know that our consumers really want more hormones, and so I think the three above are probably more needed than the fourth there. So to kind of wrap this up and summarize this a bit, I think if you followed through, you would agree that seasonality of lambing creates some supply issues, and that has negative consequences throughout the industry, all the way from the producer to the feeder to the packer to the wholesaler, restaurant, and even the consumer may pay more because of our seasonal issues that we have with providing consistent fresh lamb to the consumer. I hope that you gain from this that there is no single solution. 50% of the industry doesn't need to change to aseasonal lambing tomorrow, nor could they. That the solution requires slight adjustments in various sectors of the industry to get a more even supply of lambs. That's going to come from some people moving to aseasonal lambing. I think it's more applicable to those that aren't locked in to really harsh conditions, that don't have the facilities for it, places like Texas, California, the southern part of the Midwest, some of the southeastern part of the U.S., as opposed to the Intermountain West, where they're really strongly tied into season and summer forage production. We can also look at adjusting rates of gain. Based on breed and feed, we can take lambs that are gaining a third to a half a pound a day and manage them, or we can bump that up to 3/4 of a pound per day to a pound. So instead of a lamb taking 12 months to get to market, we can get them there in 6 months. And so some of those slight adjustments, and when we start creep feeding, maybe when we early wean some lambs, get them on to feed, we can easily spread out some of the lambs without changing lambing season at all. Another thing that would be beneficial is maybe some more forward contracts or slotting that the producers were aware of, and encourage some producers to get into contact with feeders and packers and ask if some of those contracts are available so that they can have more assurity that if they change some of their management, it will be rewarded at the end of the day. Just kind of wrapping this up here. If you hadn't caught this before, there's a white paper that goes into much more detail than what I covered in this past 40 minutes or so. You can find that white paper at lambresourcecenter.com. So go to lambresourcecenter.com, scroll to the bottom of the main page, and there's a figure of a sheep with the word seasonal right below it. Click on that. It'll take you direct to the PDF. That has an executive summary at the beginning. It's a one-pager. If you're a short attention span like me, that one-pager at the beginning, and then the full report starts after that if you want to get into more of the details. So with that, that concludes my summary of the impacts of seasonality on the U.S. lamb industry. And Jay, I will turn it back over to you and entertain questions as we have time.
All right. Thanks, Reed. That was great. I did send that URL to you in the chat box so that you online, so you may have seen that there, that you can click on it, and I'll put that in the follow-up email to you also. So we have some time for some questions. We got a couple of them that have come in already. Just to go over that real quick, you can type your questions into the question box, which is over on your control panel towards the bottom on the right of your screen, most likely on the right of your screen. Or you can raise your hand if you have a microphone connected to your computer or on a phone where you can speak to us. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can talk directly to Reed and ask your question that way. And we encourage you to do both, either one of those, whatever you're comfortable doing. So a couple of questions came in. I'll ask you the hard one first because you're going to probably throw it back in my face. Do you know if the seasonality of lamb is integrated into the price protection insurance provided through USDA?
You weren't kidding whenever you said you were going to start with the hard one. You may know more about this than I, so I'd encourage you to follow up on mine. But to my understanding, the price modeling through USDA for lamb LRP insurance accounts for the change or the predicted change in lamb prices at its certain week intervals ahead. To the degree it accounts for seasonality, I'm unclear of. So I'll turn that one back to you and allow you to elaborate.
Yeah, no, that's my understanding too, that it's a supply and demand type of model that they use for that. So in that respect, it would take care of the seasonality. I'm not sure beyond that how directly it addresses that. They keep that pretty proprietary. Okay, next question. What impact does weather during the hotter months have on product quality? And does your summary apply to goat kids equally as well as lamb? So that's, I guess, two separate questions, but from one person.
Sure. I'll start with the first one on the heat on product quality in the summer. I don't know that I've run across any literature that indicates heat having an impact on product quality. Stress normally has an impact, but I don't recall any literature on heat. But when the lamb industry roadmap was outlined, they did commission a white paper on the factors that impact lamb quality. And I believe that's on lambresourcecenter.com's website. And so I'd have to look that up, but I'm pretty sure it's there. If it's not, contact someone at the American Lamb Board and they can get access to that. And I don't recall any heat stress being in there. And that's the best that I can do with that one. The second question on the price of kids. Yes, absolutely. For the markets in Texas, if you would go to our website, that graph that I showed that had producers livestock sales with volume of sales and price. There's almost a mirror image of that for meat goats in Texas, where our abundant supplies in the summer, and that's also the biggest dip in the price. Elsewhere in the country for meat goats, I'm not sure. Texas is the leading meat goat producer, and I think has more goats than the next 8 or 9 states combined. So I would assume that the rest of the markets are going to follow that trend, but I don't keep up with them.
Thank you. And I know you had the case studies in your white paper, so that'll help you with the next one. Can you give examples of breeds that are better suited to aseasonal production for the traditional market?
Sure. The breeds, if you're a farm flock operation, the breed that probably has the strongest aseasonal background is going to be the Dorset, and then any Dorset composites like the Polypay. And so those are very common breeds for the maternal side throughout the Midwest. As you move into the western part of the U.S., where we're getting more traditional fine wool type sheep, the Rambouillet and most all of the Merino derivatives have pretty long breeding seasons, and with good, vigorous rams turned in the spring, we typically can get those used to breed out of season. Given they're in good body condition, they're beyond 40, 50 days post lambing. And again, a lot of those details were covered in that webinar done by Richard Earhart.
Yeah, and for those of you that haven't looked at the white paper or seen it yet, was there 4 example case studies, I believe, at the back of that you guys, that was a really nice touch that you guys added that. So kudos, whoever idea that was, of people integrating different breeds and trying to get aseasonal production. So
thanks.
Yeah. Question on mutton demand. I don't know if you guys discussed that at all, but do you see mutton demand growing in the U.S.?
Oh, that's really stretching me. I don't know that I'm gonna be the right person to comment on that. There's probably some lamb demand reports. I know there's a lamb demand report on the American Lamb Board's that Lamb Resource Center, and I encourage to go there. I don't know enough about the mutton demand to know where that's going. I get some things on social media and different aspects that there is some positive towards mutton demand, but I'm just not up on it to give an educated response.
Okay. I'm in the same boat you are. I see those reports, but I really focus on the lamb side of it. Comment, there does not seem to be any economic incentive to produce out-of-season lamb when it comes to what buyers pay at auction. A premium will be needed to encourage aseasonal lambing. I know you had your price graph up there, and I don't know what it's like in Texas. I don't know, different parts of the country, but would you like to comment a little bit on the prices producers see throughout the year?
Sure. One of the things that's difficult is the week-to-week variability within auctions. And what we see here in Texas is there's very evident price premiums paid in the winter for lambs compared to the summer when most of them are brought to auction. But if you look week to week, let's just say that one week there's a fair amount of rain throughout the weekend, and most of the sales are on Tuesday, and they can't get out to the ranch to get the animals to the sale, and so the volume that week drops by 20 or 30%, and the market will jump, and then everybody sees the market jump, and they make sure they get the lambs to the sale the next week, and then the volume's up 30 or 40% the next week, and the market falls down. So you see some week-to-week variability, but if you look at the big picture, in our part of the world, the seasonality does have a big impact at the auction. Within an auction, there can be some auction dynamics where lambs will sell better at the beginning of the sale versus the end of the sale based on how many, if buyers are full that week or different things. But if you take all that into account, the auctions that we've looked at do show fairly evident seasonality price incentives.
Okay. Thank you. And a couple of questions in your wheelhouse because they're production. How is the nutritional management different or significantly different from fall flushing methods? I guess they're talking about aseasonal breeding and
sure. I think that in a fall flushing scenario, if the ewes are in lighter condition, say they're body condition 2.5, we can use a little bit of supplement to pick them up and hit peak breeding, and really not see a whole lot of issues with fertility. That ewes are going to be fertile. I mean, they're cycling, they're going to breed in the fall. Flushing gives us a few more lambs. Richard Earhart was our specialist in production for this aseasonal side, so I'd encourage you to contact him if you want to follow up with this. And I know he's done a lot of work in the nutritional area, but to my understanding is if your nutrition's not right, they're not in real good condition and on decent quality feed, that they won't be fertile at all. They won't even be cycling. So it's not a difference of 130 versus 150% lamb crop. It's a difference of 30% of the ewes breeding or 90% of the ewes breeding.
Yes, and for those of you, Richard didn't see Richard's webinars earlier. He's done 2 of them for us on this Let's Grow program, and they're available on the Let's Grow site. So if you go to growourflock.org, and there's a educational webinar, so I believe is the tag on one of the menu items, and all of them are listed there. And there's 2 of them that Richard did on that he goes into all the detail that he does in the white paper, and plus a lot more because he's got cool graphics to go with it. So appreciate him being a part of that and recording those webinars for us. Along those same line, confinement operations, I know that was mentioned in there. Question on, are they being more conducive to accelerated breeding programs and whatnot? Do you see a lot of confinement operations down there in Texas? Is that more of a Midwest thing? Would you like to comment on that at all in terms of aseasonal breeding?
Sure. I mean, typically our confinement operations are the best suited for aseasonal lamb production because if you're in confinement, you generally have access to good quality forage year round. You're not dependent on the weather and rain to produce those lambs year round. And so you can, you have a lot more flexibility as to when lambs are born and how fast you can, what rates of gain you can put on them to what markets that you can hit. And so one of the things that became apparent and was kind of an aha moment to a number of people, even within the roundtable, was one of our case studies was Dan Persons, and he has an accelerated lambing system, and he lambs some ewes in the fall, but his production system is lamb in the fall and in the winter. But his fall born lambs are early weaned, and they go on feed to be a fast rate of gain, and they come off and go to market in April and May, and actually that's the worst time for them to hit the market. So because he's accelerating his rate of gain and lambing in the fall, he's producing more lambs during our glut. And so sometimes we can be our own worst enemies if we're not paying attention. But yes, absolutely, back to the original question, confinement lambing is very conducive to aseasonal lamb production.
And since you mentioned rate of gain and whatnot, question come in from birth to harvest. What is the average rate of gain across the industry, and is this a reasonable way to back into breeding dates?
I think that's a reasonable way to go about to back into breeding dates is the rate of gain. If lambs, depending on genetics, if lambs are on full feed, high quality feed right in front of them, even if that's a grass-based feed, if it's no restrictions at all and they have the genetic propensity to gain well, they're going to be gaining somewhere between 3/4 and slightly over a pound. Some of our really large framed, fast growing animals can get up into the 1.5 pound range, but that's a little outside the norm. Compared to those that are in moderate to arid environments where forage quality is good but not great, then our rates of gain are normally around a third on the low end to half a pound a day, half a pound of gain per day on the higher side. So yeah, if you're in a pasture-based setting and they're growing but not growing gangbusters, just figure a half a pound a day, and if they're on great quality feed, then you're closer to a pound per day.
Okay, thanks. And I got a follow-up question on that. If you would, I don't know if you can back up your slides and go back to, you had a carcass weight slide back when you first started doing the graphs. I don't know if you can go back to that one or not.
I'm going to have to flip out.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, carcass weights.
Yeah,
the category?
I think it's number 9. Yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the seasonality thing here. I was looking at that because you mentioned you were talking about the heavyweight carcasses through May, June, and July in particular, and then how we had all the lightweights in September. I mean, that was a big jump in terms of the blue bar, I guess, maybe medium weights, but you're back down in that range there. Is that, when you said that about getting a market established for those heavier weight carcasses and that not being a problem, but then it disappears later in the year, it seems like a natural question is why does it disappear? Why don't we just keep feeding to a heavier weight if we got a market for it? Did that come up in your guys' discussion as to why that happens? Why the heavier weight carcasses go away? Why we don't keep feeding them to those weights and satisfy that market if it's there?
Sure, yeah. So the heavier weight carcasses are present in May, June, and July, and in August, because let's just say that's this year, 2018. But those lambs are from 2017, and they're gone then by July. So then in, say, September, October, November, now we're on to 2018 born lambs. And that's just not enough time for 2018 born lambs to get that big.
Okay.
So we need lambs to go through, and they're just not present anymore. The only way I can, thinking off the cuff here, to get large carcass sized lambs in September, October, and November would be to fall lamb the year before. So they're a full year of age and they're on a higher rate of gain.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just wondering, because it disappears completely, right? So, but there's still, those harvest numbers look pretty consistent, as you mentioned early on. Is a lot of this dictated by, as you mentioned, that the plants, they need to operate as much as they can close to capacity? They want to keep a steady supply going through that plant. Is that, that seems like a big issue here, just in terms of keeping the plant busy, and maybe that's why we see everything disappear.
Yeah, correct. They'd have to keep the plant busy. They would have to slow it way down in September and October, so that some of those lambs, that instead of harvesting a lamb in September in the blue category, wait another month and get him into the next category in October. Well, to do that, you would have had too few of lambs to harvest in September, and so the throughput, they need the lambs that time of year to go through the plant to keep a fresh supply.
Mm-hmm. Which is some people's argument for, that's some of the argument for having imports, but that's not what we're seeing. Well, no, that has nothing to do with that, because we're talking about harvesting them. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it just seems like, because it disappears completely. You understand what I'm saying? So
yeah.
You think about what's the best thing for the industry. Is it better to have a lull in those months in terms of harvest numbers and have heavier, more consistent carcass weight distributions throughout the year? But it's an interesting topic there. So while I was bothering you with that, I had some more questions come in, and they're probably better than my questions. But one of them is, what do you think is a realistic, achievable goal in terms of lamb numbers from out-of-season breeding over the next 5 years in the U.S.?
That's a good question. I'm going to go back to the original slide. And I think realistically, if we could just increase that December. If you look at the December here, it's at somewhere between 3 and 4%. If we could get that up to 6%, so each of these categories, 3 or 4% of the industry increase in lambing here, that would be helpful. The other thing to note on this is this data set is not easy to come by, and I had to really dig to find this, and it's from a 2010 industry report, and that's called Sheep to 10, I think. I have to look that back up, but it's a 10-year study. So they're going to do this study again, I hope, in the next year or two, and it'll be interesting to see if that's gone up, particularly with the interest in hair sheep in Texas and lots of other parts of the country that tend to be more suitable for seasonal lamb production, both from the genetic side and two, they're not as worried about wool production. So, lambing 3 times in 2 years or 5 times in 3 years doesn't interfere with their wool production goals, and so there might be more already occurring. But a realistic goal, I would say, if we can move 2-3% in each month, and maybe try to move a few people up, say from February to March or from April to March, and try and increase that rate of gain to spread out that size. It seems like if we're going to do something, what people tend to do is hold them and feed them longer, as opposed to move up in lambing a little bit and accelerate and try to get them there quicker.
Okay. A follow-up question to my question on the weights, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but I thought this whole seasonality of lamb issue was about getting rid of those heavyweight lambs. And this person like me was probably a little surprised when you said that there is a market for those. But would you like to, because that is what we hear, that we end up with all the glut of lambs, as you call it, in the spring and heavyweight lambs in the summer. Is that one of the main focuses of trying to address the seasonality, is to avoid that issue?
Yes, I mean, we got that as we were putting this together. I don't know that we were asked to, write a white paper on the impacts of large carcass weight and the, attributes that come with that. And there's kind of a dichotomy, if you will, in the industry. Some would say that we don't have a lamb flavor problem, that our problem is, lambs just being too fat, and those 95-pound carcasses just being inefficient because there's so much waste fat. And, the consumer is always going to pay for that down the road, typically. And then there's others that say that we're ruining consumers because those too big and overweight lambs have some quality issues. And I'm not going to say one way or the other what that is. I think I was surprised as we got into it that there's a market for it, but that was kind of what was reported to us, and that's where we'll leave it at.
Okay. Question again on the aseasonal lambing, or accelerated lambing, I guess. If AU lambs in February, when might be the right time to re-enter the ram for a second breeding cycle? So just as an example.
So if the ewe lambs in February, and if we're in a confinement type system and we could early wean and have a lamb off by April, not to say that they couldn't breed with a lamb on its side, but typically we can keep more weight on them if they were weaned. And then it depends on feed resources, the area, what the environment is. But if we were able to breed that animal back in June, we could have a November lamb, and that November lamb with decent to moderate quality forage or grain fed could hit the July, August, September market fairly easily, because it's going to be, if you're breeding in June, you're going to lamb in November, and it should hit that market fairly easily.
Okay, thanks. Are hair breeds relegated to the ethnic market only by the large slaughter businesses? Is this because of size? They are great out-of-season breeders, Katahdin especially.
Yeah, I think that the hair sheep fit the non-traditional market better because they have smaller frame size, and that smaller frame size is sought after by the non-traditional market. There may be certain times of the year, particularly if you were on an accelerated production and you had a hair type U that lambed in the spring, and you were selling a 65-pound lamb in the summer, and that market is depressed, to then change your strategy and feed that lamb to a heavier weight throughout the fall and go towards a more traditional market. I think the traditional market would want that carcass size to get a bit bigger, but it could fit that market, especially if it was a terminal sire type of an animal. So I'll flip over to this other graph and show it here to kind of get what I'm talking about. But instead of selling a lightweight lamb in the fall, it's taking it, or in the summer, and taking it into the fall. And we took a hair lamb, instead of selling it at 60 to 80 pounds, taking it to 120 pounds, which is probably on the top end. That's going to be a 60-pound carcass, which fits into that black box. And there's probably a market for it, but I would encourage those producers to talk with whomever their buyers are and what their opportunities are to go to the traditional market at certain times of the year.
Okay, and we'll end with a couple of import-export questions. You mentioned a little bit about imports in the white paper, but recently Japan is now taking U.S. lamb. What should we expect for prices and demand?
Oh, I mean, it's always great to have more markets. I can't say with any certainty. The export market in the U.S., there's some exports, but it never has been a big part of our segment. We tend to underproduce what our domestic demands are. I think that the opportunities are probably going to be more for grain-fed lamb, just because within Japan there's grass-fed lamb available. I believe New Zealand and Australia could import into Japan, so they would be able to capture that market probably at a lower cost than us. I would think maybe grain-fed and really high-end product would be where we could capture value, but that's a wild guess, really.
And tariffs are in the news lately. Is there a tariff on imported lamb?
I do not believe that there is a tariff on imported lamb.
Yeah, I think there was one once upon a time, a long, long time ago, but I don't think we have anything now on it. But
no, I don't believe there's anything now. I think there has been some tariffs proposed for wool garments and things that have been imported, and then China has retaliated with a proposed 25% tariff on wools from the U.S. going into China. But I have not heard any tariff trade controversy regarding lamb.
yeah, the only thing I've heard is I think it's RCAF is calling for tariffs, but that's not just for lamb, that's beef, and I think just to all meats, if I remember right. But I'm not aware of anything currently. But all right, well, Reed, I appreciate you coming on and presenting that seasonality white paper issue. There's a lot of stuff to cover there and a lot of things to talk about, and I really appreciate you and your co-authors putting that together, and I'm sure it'll stimulate some conversation. So thank you for doing that, and appreciate you talking tonight.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and thanks to everybody for being on. I'll follow up with a email with when the recording is available. That should happen within the next 48 hours. It'll also have a link to read slides, as well as a link to that white paper itself. If you don't want to wait till that, you can go to the Lamb Resource Center and find that. As Reed said, scroll down to the bottom and click on the link. And with that, I'll go ahead and bid you good night. We have one more webinar coming up next month also, I should mention, on September 18th. We're going to have Brett Taylor from the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station talking on vaccination strategies. So look for that email coming out in the next week to 10 days with a link to register. So with that, I'll go ahead and sign off for tonight and thank everybody for joining us. And once again, thanks to Dr. Redden for his great presentation.